gear adjusted. The crew disembarked in silence, each step crunching against the strange, granular surface. The air was thick with a metallic tang, despite their helmets' filtration systems. "Radiation levels are within tolerable limits," Wagner announced. "But this atmosphere wasn't supposed to have this much static charge. Keep your systems calibrated." Harlow knelt by a small cluster of rocks, brushing sand away with her gloved hand. She frowned. "No erosion patterns." Voss looked up from her diagnostic pad. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Harlow murmured, standing, "that nothing's moved these rocks in centuries. Not wind, not water. This place doesn't just look dead, it feels preserved." They moved toward a higher ridge to set up a temporary base. The climb was slow, the shifting sands dragging at their boots. By the time they reached the top, the sun, a sickly red disk, was sinking low on the horizon. That's when they saw them. Half buried in the slope below were figures, dozens of them, motionless in the sand. The chatter. He stared down at the lifeless forms. Their skin was pale and cracked, clinging tightly to bones beneath. There were no clothes, no remnants of civilization, no visible wounds. Yet something about their arrangement made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "They look mummified," Harlow whispered, stepping closer. Voss shuddered. "How did they get here? There's no record of any colonization attempt." "They're not human," Royce interrupted. "Look closer." The team fell silent. He was right. Despite their outwardly humanoid shapes, the proportions were wrong. Legs too long, rib cages expanded as though something had forced them open from the inside. "Back up," Royce ordered. "Don't touch anything until we scan them." But Wagner didn't listen. He moved forward, curiosity overriding caution. He crouched next to one of the bodies and extended a hand. "Wagner, stop!" Before Royce could intervene, Wagner brushed the sand from the thing's face. Its eyes, lidless and sunken, were open, glassy, staring. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the creature's head twitched. It was barely perceptible, like the dying spasm of an insect. But it was enough. Wagner recoiled, stumbling back as the rest of the team rushed forward. "Did you see that?" Wagner gasped. It moved. "It's dead," Royce said firmly, though his voice was tight. "Get back." The last rays of the sun bled away, leaving the landscape in shadow. As the team regrouped, something else caught Royce's eye. A faint indentation in the sand near his boot. He knelt, tracing it with his glove. A footprint, too recent to be ancient. His heart thudded in his chest as he slowly rose and turned toward the slope. A trail of similar imprints led away from where the bodies lay. They were uneven, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had struggled to walk. The tracks vanished into the darkness. Later, at base camp, the unease lingered like static in the air. The inflatable shelter hummed softly as it pressurized, the lights casting sterile shadows across their gear. Royce sat at the central console, replaying the drone footage of the ridge over and over. "What are you looking for?" Harlow asked, setting down her equipment. Royce leaned forward. Something wrong, Voss chuckled nervously. You mean aside from the dead people-shaped things twitching? No? Royce froze the image. There, just before the drone veered right, a faint movement in the corner of the frame. A blur of motion, too fast, too deliberate. He rewound, playing it again at half speed. A shape, something crawling out of the sand just beyond their line of sight. I don't like this, Voss muttered. You're not alone, Royce whispered. That night, sleep was fleeting and restless. The desert wind, or what passed for wind on this dead world, scraped softly against the shelter walls. At first, Royce thought he was imagining it, the soft, rhythmic sound like something being dragged. But then, through the thin fabric of the shelter, he saw a shadow shift, low to the ground, moving slowly past the perimeter. He grabbed his sidearm, heart pounding. The rest of the team stirred as he moved toward the exit. The desert beyond was empty, vast, and still. The stars shimmered faintly overhead. Yet Royce couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the darkness. And then, just before he turned back, he saw them again. Footprints trailing away from the camp, deeper into the sands. This time they were closer, and they didn't match any of their boots. The next morning, the sky above Thalassa was bruised with murky red and gray clouds, casting long, jagged shadows across the sands. Royce didn't sleep. None of them had, not really. Harlow's eyes were sunken, and even Wagner, who usually masked his nerves with sarcasm, looked gaunt and pale as they packed their gear. The tracks Royce found had vanished with the shifting dunes overnight, but the memory of them lingered. Something had been moving out there, alive in a way that defied every report, every scan, every biological possibility. Drones picking up a structure half a kilometer east, Voss said, studying her data pad. She hesitated, brow furrowed. Looks like it's buried, but some of it's intact. I think we've found where those things came from. Royce adjusted his visor, narrowing his eyes. Then that's where we're heading. No one argued. The walk to the site was slow, their boots dragging through the unstable terrain. The heat was oppressive, despite the sun being obscured by the swirling clouds. As they crested the last ridge, the sand fell away to reveal something massive, twisted metal and stone half consumed by the planet itself. It's some kind of facility, Harlow breathed. Most of the structure was submerged, but a jagged opening was visible, like a mouth, yawning open and waiting for them. Black scorch marks stained the surrounding metal. This doesn't look like a lab. It looks like a crash site, Wagner muttered. It wasn't a crash, Harlow said softly. Look at the design. It's built into the ground. Whatever this was, they wanted it hidden. Royce stepped forward, gripping his rifle tightly. The opening led into a narrow corridor lined with broken lights. The stale air reeked of rust and something else, something faint but rancid, like decay long forgotten. Stay close, Royce said as they entered. Their footsteps echoed down the metallic corridor, every sound swallowed by the thick silence. The walls were scarred with deep, claw-like gouges. Harlow ran her fingers over them, her expression grim. These aren't tool marks, she whispered. Something did this. Further in, the corridor opened into a large chamber. Rows of cylindrical glass pods lined the walls, some shattered, their contents spilled onto the floor long ago. What remained inside the intact pods made the crew pause. The creatures inside were similar to those they found buried in the sands, pale, grotesque parodies of humanoid life. Their skeletal frames were twisted unnaturally, their elongated arms pressed against the glass as though they had died clawing for escape. But these forms were unfinished. Tumorous growths spiraled along their limbs. Some of their torsos were partially split, ribs and sinew exposed like grotesque sculptures. Harlow swallowed hard. What the hell were they doing here? Wagner knelt by a broken pod, brushing away shards of glass. A plaque affixed to the base bore an inscription in faded alien script. Below it was a rough translation etched in small human writing. Adaptation beyond limitation. Life that endures. Royce frowned. They were experimenting on these things. No, Harlow corrected, her voice trembling. They were creating them. At the far end of the chamber, they found a control console, half buried in debris. Voss cleared it off and powered it up with a pulse from her portable generator. The screen flickered, dim text scrolling across it in fragmented bursts. Primary containment breached. All personnel evacuated, organic systems failing, experiment integrity compromised. Royce's jaw tightened. This wasn't just research. This was a bioweapons project. Harlow leaned in, scrolling through corrupted data logs. One entry stood out. A log recorded by the facility's chief scientist, its audio distorted but still intelligible. The adaptives have reached a threshold we didn't predict. They don't just survive, they consume. They merge with dead tissue, rebuilding themselves from anything they touch. They're learning to spread. We tried to sterilize the lab, but it was too late. They've become something else entirely. A cold weight settled in Royce's stomach. They weren't designed to be soldiers, Harlow said, horror dawning in her voice. They were meant to survive in any environment, adapt to death itself. But now they've become parasites of their own flesh. Suddenly, a faint mechanical groan reverberated through the chamber. The floor beneath them vibrated, a low hum building through the walls. Movement, Voss warned, raising her plasma cutter. From one of the intact pods, a crack snaked across the glass. Royce stepped forward, his pulse quickening. The figure inside, a skeletal form with distended limbs, twitched, its head rolling unnaturally. "No way," Wagner whispered. The crack widened, spiderwebbing across the surface. With a sharp hiss, the pod exploded outward, shards clattering to the floor. The creature fell forward in a tangle of limbs. For a moment it lay still, then its arms jerked, pushing its emaciated body upright. Its head twisted toward them. The mouth hung open in a grotesque, soundless scream. "Back!" Royce shouted. The thing lurched forward, its legs bending wrong as it shambled toward them. Voss fired first, a searing beam of plasma that struck the creature's torso. The flesh melted, splitting open with a wet crack. But instead of collapsing, the creature's exposed musculature stretched. Tendrils of raw sinew latched onto the floor and walls, pulling it forward. Its remaining arm elongated, twisting into a jagged hook of bone. "Jesus, what is that?" Wagner yelled. "It's trying to rebuild itself," Harlow shouted. Royce aimed and fired at the base of its skull. The creature's head snapped back with a sickening crunch before it slumped to the ground. Its body convulsed once, then went still. A tense silence filled the chamber. Voss wiped sweat from her brow. "Tell me we're done here." Royce's gaze drifted to the remaining pods. Some were empty, broken from the inside. Others had bodies still floating in their containment fluid. But then he noticed something worse. Small, worm-like appendages writhing at the base of some of the tubes. Even the pods that hadn't broken yet were teeming with movement. "We're not done," Royce said grimly. He turned toward the exit. "We need to leave. Now." They barely made it back to the surface before the facility groaned beneath them, releasing a deep, guttural sound, almost like the death rattle of a dying beast. Behind them, the shadows of the buried past seemed to follow. And in the distance, the sand stirred. Something was still moving out there. The storm rolled in from the west, churning sand into the air and blotting out what little light remained. By the time the team reached the shelter, the sky was a writhing mass of dust and shadow. The wind howled around them, but inside the base, the silence was deafening. Royce sealed the hatch behind them, his gloved hand trembling as he twisted the lock. "Everyone check your systems," he muttered, voice low. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Wagner dropped onto a crate, staring at the floor. His breathing was uneven, like he'd just sprinted miles. Harlow didn't speak. She sat at the makeshift table, staring blankly at the data pad in front of her, the light from the screen casting a hollow glow across her face. Voss broke the silence. "What the hell did we just see?" Her voice was shaking despite the bravado she tried to inject into it. "No one's going to believe this," Wagner mumbled, running his hand through his sweat-slicked hair. "Dead things don't move. They don't rebuild themselves." "They do now," Royce muttered. Harlow finally lifted her head, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "They're not alive. Not in the way we understand it. The logs said they're recombinators, adaptive. They don't need life to function. They just need matter." Voss slammed her hand on the table. "That thing wasn't just adapting. It was hunting us." She pointed at Harlow. "How do we stop it? Can we even stop it?" Harlow hesitated. "They're parasites, but worse. They don't just invade tissue, they become it. That thing we saw, it was both itself and something else. And if it finds anything dead, anything at all, it'll grow stronger." Wagner stood suddenly, his face pale but determined. "We have to kill every last one of them, burn the bodies, seal the entire structure." Royce didn't respond. He was staring at the data logs again, replaying the chief scientist's last message. "They learn. They grow. They spread. We try to control them, but they have only one directive: survival at any cost." Something in that phrase twisted in his gut. Survival at any cost. Royce looked up. "They didn't start this way." The others fell silent. "They were designed to be resilient, yes," he continued, pacing slowly. "But something changed. They were forced to adapt to something beyond what the researchers intended." He stopped and turned to Harlow. "You said the organisms were incomplete, right?" Harlow nodded slowly. Yes, the bodies we saw, the ones in the pods, they looked like unfinished versions of what they were supposed to be. Royce's eyes narrowed. What if they were never supposed to survive the initial stages? What if something went wrong during the process? Like an infection within the adaptation process itself? Voss asked, incredulous. An error? That made them this? Harlow tapped her fingers nervously on the table. It's possible. A biological glitch, or some foreign mutation. Instead of evolving into resilient forms, they became predatory, reconstructive. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the truth settling over her. They didn't evolve to live. They evolved to consume. Wagner's voice cut through the tension. Doesn't matter what they were supposed to be. They're monsters now. Royce turned toward the weapons cache, pulling out his plasma rifle and checking the charge. We need to go back. Voss balked. Go back? Did you miss the part where that thing almost ripped us apart? Royce locked eyes with her. There are more of them, and they've been moving underground. If we don't find out how many there are and stop them, they could spread. This isn't just a graveyard, it's a time bomb. The room fell silent again as the truth sank in. Harlow spoke softly. We need to destroy the source. Whatever triggered their evolution, it's still down there. Wagner's jaw tightened. And if there's no way to stop it? Royce's voice was grim. Then we bury it, for good. The storm hadn't let up by the time they reached the facility again. The entrance yawned open beneath the swirling sand, as if waiting for them. They descended cautiously, lights cutting thin beams through the darkness. The deeper they went, the worse the air became, thick with the stench of rot and copper. Royce led them to a sealed door they hadn't opened before, the metal corroded and warped. Voss worked the manual override, sparks flaring as she forced the mechanism. The door groaned and slid open, revealing a vast, domed chamber. The walls pulsed with a faint, sickly glow, veins of organic material threaded through the metal like roots invading a corpse. At the center of the room was a massive, half-collapsed containment vat. The thing inside was no longer humanoid. It was a mass of sinew, bones, and membranous flesh, an amalgamation of failed bodies fused into a single grotesque form. A dozen elongated arms, some fused into jagged limbs, others twitching like severed nerves. It pulsed, swollen with something vile and alien. My God, Harlow whispered, it's the source, or what's left of it. As they stepped forward, the thing shifted. One of its heads, if it could be called a head, rolled toward them, its featureless face splitting into a wide, quivering maw. It began to move. Open fire, Royce yelled. The room erupted with bursts of plasma and heat. The creature writhed, its limbs flailing as chunks of flesh were seared away. But for every piece that fell, new tendrils sprouted, knitting themselves back together. It's regenerating, Voss screamed. Wagner threw an incendiary charge at its base. The blast sent a wave of heat through the chamber, setting the sinewy mass ablaze. The creature's scream was a deafening, primal wail, a sound that clawed at their minds. But as the fire consumed it, something strange happened. The creature's body began to collapse inward, folding into itself. The flames revealed something at its core, a black-spined organ, pulsing weakly. "That's it," Harlow shouted. "That's what's keeping it alive." Royce didn't hesitate. He sprinted forward, dodging a flailing limb, and drove his plasma blade deep into the organ. The chamber filled with a blinding light as the creature spasmed violently. Its limbs convulsed, then crumbled to ash. The pulsing veins in the walls shriveled, turning brittle and gray. Silence returned. Royce staggered back, panting. The others stared at the smoldering remains. The monstrous form was gone, reduced to dust. Wagner lowered his weapon. Is it over?" Harlow knelt beside the remains, brushing ash away to reveal the charred organ. It was dead, inert. She nodded slowly. "Yes, it's over." But as they prepared to leave, Royce glanced toward the far side of the room, where something small and pale twitched among the ashes, a fragment of tissue, writhing weakly. He crushed it under his boot without a word. "We're sealing this place," he said. His voice was cold, final. No one argued. They knew better. Some truths needed to be buried. The long trek back to the Aegis felt like crossing the edge of a dream and nightmare, the thin line between relief and terror. The storm had finally died, but the sky was still choked with ash and dust, the horizon a blurred smear of red and gray. The world around them was as silent as a tomb. Royce led the way, his footsteps slow but deliberate. Voss followed close behind, her plasma cutter clutched tightly. Harlow walked in the middle, her face pale and tight, cradling the last data drive they had pulled from the ruins. Wagner brought up the rear, silent, his usual bravado gone. No one spoke, but the weight of their thoughts pressed down like the gravity of a collapsing star. They had destroyed the grotesque amalgamation in the chamber. They had destroyed the source. But had it been enough? The Aegis's landing platform hissed as it descended, and the ship's exterior lights cast long beams across the shifting sands. The sight of the ship should have filled Royce with relief. It was their way home, their salvation. But something inside him felt hollow. Once inside, they sealed the hatch, and the familiar hum of the ship's systems kicked in. They finally felt insulated from the hostile world outside. "Systems check," Voss murmured, more out of habit than necessity. Her voice was low, mechanical, as though she didn't quite believe they'd made it back alive. The ship's sterile lights made everything seem surreal. Wagner sat down heavily, running his hands over his face. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." Harlow placed the data drive on the central console and leaned against the wall, staring blankly at the glowing panel. Royce watched her, frowning. "You don't look like someone who believes it's over," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "Because it's not." The room went still. Wagner let out a shaky laugh. "Come on, Harlow. We burned it to the ground. We buried it." Harlow shook her head. "You saw the same thing I did." Her voice was soft, hollow. "It wasn't just a creature. It was an idea, a biological imperative to survive at any cost. That thing wasn't alive in the way we think. It was designed to keep existing, even in pieces. You saw what happened with Wagner's infection. You saw how it tried to spread." She finally looked up, eyes haunted. "We destroyed the core, But how do we know that was the only one? Silence fell again, heavier this time. Royce's jaw tightened. He turned to the central console and keyed in the long-range communication beacon. The screen flickered to life, displaying the familiar insignia of the Earth Colonial Council. "What are you doing?" Wagner asked, sitting up. Royce didn't look at him. "I'm sending a warning." Voss's eyes widened. "A warning? You know what they'll do if they hear what happened down there." "They'll quarantine the entire sector," Wagner said. "Maybe worse. They could order a complete sterilization of the planet." "And maybe that's exactly what needs to happen," Royce replied, voice hard. "We can't risk this spreading." Harlow stepped forward, her expression a mixture of fear and fury. "If we tell them everything we learned down there, all of our research, it'll be destroyed." She gestured to the data drive. "That information could change everything we know about biology, about survival, medicine, evolution." Royce met her gaze. "Or it could kill millions of people." "You don't know that," Harlow's voice cracked. "Royce, what if we're wrong? What if there's a way to control it? We owe it to those people, to every life that was lost in that experiment, to figure out what went wrong. If we destroy this now, we're burying the truth. We're pretending it never happened." "That truth almost got us killed," Voss muttered. "And you think it's worth saving?" "It's worth understanding," Harlow shot back. "If we don't, this will happen again somewhere else. Maybe not on Thalassa, but somewhere. Because someone else will try to outsmart nature. Someone else will push too far. We have a chance to learn from this." Royce stared at her for a long moment. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the fear beneath her conviction. She wasn't wrong, but neither was he. "There's a choice," Harlow continued, voice soft now. "There's always a choice. Survival or destruction, salvation or annihilation. You told me once that some things aren't meant to survive, but maybe this isn't one of them." Royce felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The warning signal blinked, waiting for his command. He glanced at the others. Voss avoided his gaze, her arms crossed tightly. Wagner looked torn, his fingers tapping nervously against his leg. Harlow stood firm, her breath shallow but steady. Royce took a slow, deliberate breath. Then he reached for the console. Time slowed. With a single press of his finger, the beacon activated, sending out a coded transmission into the void. The message was simple, carried the weight of everything they'd seen, everything they'd survived. Planet Thalassa. Quarantine advised. Biological threat detected. Terminate any attempts at recovery. The screen flashed, confirming the transmission had been sent. Harlow's face crumpled. She took a step back, disbelief and betrayal in her eyes. You didn't even give it a chance." Royce closed his eyes briefly, pain lancing through his chest. "I did. This is the chance." Harlow turned away, biting back tears as she sank into the corner of the room. Wagner sat in stunned silence, and Voss let out a long, shaky breath. Royce stepped away from the console and headed toward the pilot's chair. "Prep for launch," he ordered, his voice steady but distant. "We're going home." The engines roared to life beneath them, shaking the deck as the Aegis rose from the ground. Through the viewport, the surface of Thalassa receded, a lifeless, crimson wasteland slowly swallowed by distance. As they ascended into the void, Royce kept his eyes forward, but his thoughts were far below, buried in the sand and ash. The things they'd found on that planet, the things they'd destroyed, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Some truths deserved to be remembered, others were better left buried. The ship broke through the planet's orbit, leaving Thalassa behind. The screen on the console flickered one last time, showing a final image from the surface. The dust was settling, but something small, something pale writhed beneath the sands, and then the feed went dark. Royce exhaled slowly as the stars stretched into endless streaks of light around them. In the quiet hum of space, only one thought remained. Was it enough? The gate loomed before us, ancient and terrible, like a fossilized ribcage of some long-dead titan. Its jagged edges shimmered faintly under the harsh floodlights of the hangar, casting an otherworldly glow that made the air hum in my chest. The glyphs etched into its surface pulsed softly, organic yet calculated, as though they weren't carved at all, but grown. We'd studied them for years, debating their purpose, their creators, and the terrifying energy signature that spiked every time the gate stirred. None of us thought it would actually open, yet here it was, wide, empty, and waiting. Graves. The voice crackled in my earpiece. Commander Holt. Proceed on my mark. I adjusted the harness strapped tight across my chest, feeling the weight of the equipment on my back. Oxygen reserve, biometric scanner, emergency disruptor. All of it useless if this went wrong. The rest of the team, Reese Morales and Dr. Aria Holt, stood in formation behind me, shadows beneath the gate's immense arch. 3, 2, 1, mark. The air twisted. The surface of the gate rippled like molten glass. A low, resonant sound pulsed from its core, making my teeth vibrate. Light poured from the void, a deep, ultraviolet glow that seemed to pierce straight into my skull. I stepped forward, heart hammering as the threshold closed in. There was no countdown for this part, no hesitation allowed. One step and the world dissolved around me. I felt myself fall, not downward, but inward. The sensation was impossible to describe, like being stretched across dimensions, ripped apart and stitched back together. My mind shattered into static, then reassembled itself in a single deafening heartbeat. When the light receded, I was no longer on Earth. The sky above me was endless and wrong. A void stretched overhead, swirling with faint phosphorescent strands like distant neural pathways in the dark. The sun, if you could call it that, was a pale, sickly orb pulsating in the distance. The ground beneath my boots was black and glassy, like obsidian polished to a mirror sheen. Ahead of us, an immense platform stretched for miles, its surface embedded with strange veins of green bioluminescence. Jesus Christ, Reese muttered behind me, his voice wavering through the calms. Where the hell are we? Dr. Holt knelt beside one of the glowing veins, her fingers hovering an inch above the surface. It's alive, she whispered. The platform. It's some kind of biological composite. She turned toward me, her eyes wide behind the visor of her helmet. It's not just stone. It's growing. That should have been impossible. And yet, as I stared closer, I could see what she meant. The way the veins pulsed faintly beneath the glass, as though something beneath the surface was feeding it. Or breathing. "Keep moving," I said, trying to sound calm. "Stay together, and don't touch anything unless absolutely necessary." The platform led to a monolithic structure in the distance, a tower of spiraling crystalline spines that gleamed like frozen lightning. There were no visible windows, no doors, only sharp angular planes that jutted toward the void above. As we walked, the silence became deafening. There was no wind, no atmosphere to stir the air. Only the crunch of our boots against the strange, brittle surface. Even the radio static felt swallowed. After 20 minutes, we reached the base of the tower. Up close, its true scale became horrifying. It wasn't a single structure, it was many, fused together in grotesque organic symmetry. Massive tendrils of bone-like material spiraled around its circumference, some twisting back into the structure like roots, burying themselves deep into flesh. Morales swore under his breath. "We're standing inside a goddamn ribcage." I didn't argue. It was exactly what it looked like. Dr. Holt ran a hand along one of the ridges. This architecture, it's not random." She pointed toward a series of repeating glyphs carved into the bone-like protrusions. "It's Osirith, same structure as the inscriptions on the gate. Whoever built the gate, they built this too." Reese muttered something inaudible, his voice a mix of awe and fear. I barely registered it. My focus was on the entrance ahead, a narrow aperture, barely wider than a man, carved into the structure's base. The walls surrounding it pulsated faintly, like the slow inhale and exhale of a slumbering beast. "Ready?" I asked, gripping my disruptor. The team nodded reluctantly. We stepped through the aperture into the tower's shadowed interior. The entrance to the flesh cathedral gaped before us, its jagged arch lined with sinewy, red-hued filaments that pulsed with a steady rhythm, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat. I hesitated, staring at the strange membrane stretched across the threshold. It was semi-transparent, the way muscle tissue looks when cut too thin. Through it, I could see the faint glow of something shifting on the other side. Arya stepped up beside me, her voice hushed. "It's alive, isn't it?" I nodded, swallowing the knot of fear lodged in my throat. "We don't have a choice." The gate behind us had sealed shut, as though the tower itself had decided we couldn't leave until we ventured deeper. Reese muttered a curse and stepped forward, disruptor in hand. He pressed the muzzle against the membrane and fired. A flash of light, a sharp crackle. The membrane rippled but didn't break. It absorbed the shot, its pulsing undisturbed. Morales looked back at me, sweat beading on his forehead. "How the hell do we get in?" Before I could answer, the membrane opened. The fibers peeled back with a sick, wet tearing sound, revealing the cathedral's interior. I caught a glimpse of something vast and terrible beyond, a chasm of shifting bone and tissue, the walls lined with twitching organic spires. The floor writhed like muscle under skin. No turning back now. We stepped inside, the entrance sealing itself behind us. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with the scent of copper and rot. The chamber was cavernous, its vaulted ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. Columns of braided cartilage twisted upward, their surfaces studded with calcified growths that resembled tumorous organs. The walls throbbed with every step we took, the glow of bioluminescent veins casting everything in a sickly green hue. In the center of the chamber was an altar-like platform, a grotesque dais formed of interlocking bones. A humanoid figure lay spread across it, partially fused to the surface by thick cords of flesh. It was dead, or at least I thought it was. Its ribcage had split open, revealing clusters of translucent, writhing tendrils where its organs should have been. Arya's voice was barely above a whisper. "Is that Osiris?" It had to be. The elongated limbs, the metallic implants embedded in its skin. It matched the holograms we'd seen in the archivum. But this wasn't a recording. This was real, and it was horrific. Rhys took a step forward, eyes wide. "Look at its chest, that thing." He stopped abruptly, doubling over with a groan. "Ugh. My head feels like..." His words dissolved into a retching cough. I ran to him, catching his arm just as he staggered. Blood dripped from his nose, thick and dark. His pupils had dilated to black pools. "Rhys, stay with me." He convulsed violently, his spine arching unnaturally. I heard a crack as one of his vertebrae shifted beneath his skin. Something sharp and rigid pushed upward, stretching the fabric of his suit. He screamed, a high, jagged sound of pure agony. And then it happened. His back split open, a wet, sickening tear. Something long and serpentine unfurled from his body, a slick, sinewy appendage covered in pulsating nodules. Rhys's scream turned into a guttural, choking noise as the appendage twisted around his torso, pulling him upright. His arms flailed, but his eyes, they weren't his anymore. They bulged unnaturally, filled with the same pale green light I'd seen in the Archivum corpse. Morales screamed, "What the hell is that thing?" Arya grabbed my arm. "We have to run, now." Rhys, or whatever he had become, twisted its head toward us. The fleshy appendage retracted slightly, then lashed forward with horrifying speed. We barely dodged as it slammed into the floor, cracking the bone-like surface. We sprinted toward the far end of the chamber, where an archway led deeper into the cathedral. I heard the wet slap of the creature's movements behind us, its distorted limbs dragging across the floor. The sound of Rhys's strangled voice echoed after us. "Wait. Please, don't leave me." I felt something inside me crack at the sound, but I didn't stop running. I couldn't. Not if we wanted to live. The next chamber was even more disturbing than the last. It was shaped like a cathedral nave, the walls narrowing as they stretched upward. Rows of what looked like pews lined the sides, except they weren't pews. They were humanoid figures fused together in rows, their flesh melted into the bone-like seats. Their faces were frozen in expressions of agony, their mouths sewn shut by strands of organic fiber. Their eyes, hollow and leaking ichor, followed us as we passed. Arya stumbled to a halt, staring at the figures in horror. "They're still alive." A sudden crash from behind us. Rhys's transformed body barreled through the archway, its appendage whipping back and forth, leaving deep gouges in the floor. Desperation clawed at me. I raised the disruptor and fired. The shot hit Reese dead center, but instead of stopping, his body absorbed the energy. The green glow in his eyes intensified. Arya's voice cut through the chaos. "The nodes! Hit the damn nodes!" She was right. The tendrils, the nerve clusters, on the appendage. I took aim at one of the writhing nodules near Reese's shoulder and fired. The disruptor's beam sliced through the mass, severing it with a wet sizzle. Reese, or the creature wearing his body, let out an unearthly screech, collapsing to the ground in a convulsing heap. The bone door cracked open just enough to reveal a narrow passage. Morales shoved it wider with a grunt. "Go! Go!" We ran through, dragging Arya as the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crunch. The room we entered was smaller, circular, with smooth walls that pulsed faintly with dim yellow light. In the center was a massive organic pillar twisting upward like a helix. It was covered in translucent sacs that pulsed with liquid. Arya knelt, clutching her side. She was bleeding, just a shallow cut, but the sight of it made my stomach twist. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw the same horror I felt. Reese was gone, but the thing that had taken him was still here. I stared at the pillar, at the writhing sacs embedded in its surface. "This isn't a cathedral," I whispered. "It's a womb." Arya's face went pale. "Then what the hell is it giving birth to?" Before I could answer, the sacs began to split open, and something inside began to move. The air in the passage was thick with the smell of bile and decay. Every breath felt like I was swallowing something alive. The walls closed in tighter the deeper we went, organic ridges narrowing until the floor beneath us was more tendon than stone. The glow of the bioluminescent veins had dimmed to a pale amber, pulsing slowly like a dying heartbeat. Arya's footsteps faltered beside me. "We're heading towards something massive," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You can feel it." She was right. The entire structure, the cathedral, the spires, the endless layers of flesh and bone, was converging toward a central point. I didn't need a scanner to know it. I felt it in my gut, in the steady, droning hum that had wormed its way into my skull since the moment we crossed the gate. Ahead of us, the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, so vast it seemed to swallow sound. The ceiling was lost in darkness, but the glow from below illuminated enough to make my stomach turn. It wasn't a chamber. It was a cavity. The walls writhed with interwoven tendrils of muscle and bone, and below, an immense biological mass pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. It was shaped like a heart, but impossibly large, its veins as thick as bridges, pumping luminous green fluid in slow, deliberate surges. Morales let out a shaky breath. "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Arya took a step forward, her voice barely audible. "It's the core, the source of everything, the Osirith. They built their entire civilization around this." I forced myself to speak. "It's alive, alive and dying," she murmured. I followed her gaze and saw what she meant. The surface of the massive heart-like structure was lined with deep fissures, splitting the tissue apart like cracks in stone. Tendrils of necrotic flesh dangled from the walls, frayed and lifeless. Black ichor leaked from the wounds, dripping into the pool of luminous fluid below. This wasn't just an organ. It was a biological engine, and it was failing. We descended the narrow path that spiraled downward toward the base of the structure. The deeper we went, the louder the pulsing became, a slow, resonant thud-thud that rattled in our bones. It felt like being inside something that was barely holding itself together. When we reached the bottom, we saw the truth of it. Arya's eyes widened. That's the singularity. That's what powers everything. The Osiris' last desperate gamble. They had tried to stabilize their world by anchoring it to the singularity, a fragment of pure cosmic force. But it wasn't working. The sphere wasn't stabilizing the world anymore. It was tearing it apart. Morales stepped back, shaking his head. We can't be here. We need to get out, now. I stared at the sphere, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We can't leave. They both turned to me, confusion and fear in their eyes. I pointed toward the singularity. The gate. It's connected to that thing. If this world collapses, the connection won't just end. It'll collapse the fabric between dimensions. Earth will get caught in the fallout. Arya paled. So what do we do? My voice felt distant. We sever the connection. We destroy the singularity. Morales' face twisted with disbelief. Destroy it? Are you insane? We're barely holding on as it is. If you destabilize that thing, we'll be vaporized before we can even... I cut him off. There's no other way. This isn't just about us anymore. If this place falls apart, Earth is next. Arya moved closer, gripping my arm. How do you even destroy something like this? I hesitated, staring at the sphere's shimmering surface. I could feel the energy radiating from it, cold and vast, like staring into the void of space. And then I remembered what the Archivum recordings had shown us. The Osiris tried to bind it to themselves, I said slowly. They thought they could merge with the singularity, become one with it, stabilize it. Arya's eyes widened. You're saying someone has to merge with it? That's insane. It's the only way, I whispered. Morales backed away, his voice cracking. Number, no way. We're not sacrificing someone for this. There's got to be another... The chamber shook violently. The fissures in the heart widened, spraying black ichor across the walls. The veins along the floor ruptured, releasing clouds of noxious gas. The pulsing became erratic, like a dying heartbeat. Arya's hand tightened on mine. There's no time, she said. Her eyes searched mine, full of fear, and something else. Resolve. It has to be me. My breath caught in my throat. No. She took a step forward, her gaze locked on the singularity. I've already been exposed to the symbiote strain. You saw what happened back there. It's in me, Ethan. It's only a matter of time before... No! I grabbed her shoulders, shaking my head. We can figure this out. We can get you out of here, I swear. She smiled, and the sight of it broke me. You know that's not true. The chamber shook again, more violently this time. The walls began to collapse inward, tendrils snapping like frayed nerves. The heart's pulsing slowed to a terrible, shuddering thrum. Arya reached up, brushing her hand against my faceplate. You have to let me do this. Tears blurred my vision. I can't. You have to. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against mine through the visor. You saved me once. Now, let me save you." Before I could stop her, she pulled away and stepped toward the singularity. The energy rippled around her, distorting her silhouette like a mirage. The tendrils of the heart wrapped around her, drawing her closer. "Arya!" I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the growing hum of the singularity. Her body arched as the energy engulfed her. For a brief, terrible moment, her form became translucent, her veins glowing with blinding white light. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She simply became. The chamber erupted with light. When the brightness faded, the heart was silent. The fissures had sealed. The veins pulsed in steady, rhythmic waves once more. The singularity was gone. Its power absorbed, stabilized. But Arya was gone too. I stood there, shaking, my mind unable to process what I'd just seen. Morales put a hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. All I could see was the empty space where she'd stood. The ground beneath us began to shift. The cathedral was collapsing. Morales pulled me toward the exit, shouting something I couldn't hear. I stumbled after him, numb and hollow. We reached the gate chamber just as the last of the structure began to fall apart. The gate pulsed faintly, fading, unstable. Morales dove through, disappearing in a flash of light. I turned back one last time, my gaze lingering on the ruins of the heart. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Then I stepped through the gate, and the world dissolved around me. The world snapped back into place around me. The sterile white of the Area 51 hangar was blinding after the alien darkness of Thalaxis. The gate let out a final groan and sealed behind me, its obsidian glyphs dimming to lifeless stone. I collapsed to my knees, my breath ragged. The harsh desert air stung my lungs, the weight of gravity pressing down on me like a vice. The hangar was empty except for the observation crew staring from the control booth above. I could see their expressions, shocked, confused, afraid. They didn't know. They didn't know what I'd just left behind. 2 soldiers ran toward me, their boots echoing through the hangar. I didn't resist when they hauled me to my feet and led me to the decontamination chamber. My ears were ringing, my vision blurred. Everything felt distant, like I was still caught between worlds. I heard their voices as though from underwater. "Where's the rest of your team? Dr. Graves, can you hear me? Where's Dr. Holt?" Arya's name hit me like a knife to the gut. I closed my eyes, willing myself not to break. "She's gone." Saying it aloud would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. The cold blast of the decontamination jets shocked me back to the present. The medics fussed over me, scanning for radiation, pathogens, anything alien. I barely felt their hands as they took blood samples and checked my vitals. I wanted to scream at them to stop. None of it mattered. All that mattered was that Arya wasn't here. "Vitals stable," one of them muttered. "No biological contamination detected." A lie. I could feel something beneath my skin, a faint, rhythmic hum where her hand had brushed my faceplate. Finally, they left me alone in the briefing room, the heavy steel door sealing shut behind them. The walls seemed to close in around me. The silence was unbearable. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling. I stared down at them, at the faint outline of green veins still visible on my wrist. The glow was fading. But it was there, a reminder. She was gone, but she'd left a part of herself behind. The door opened and General Harrington stepped in. He was an older man with a face carved by years of secrets and sacrifices. He set a file down on the table and folded his arms. Graves. His voice was cold, precise. What happened out there? I swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. The Osirith. Their world was dying. The singularity was destabilizing everything. And the mission? He leaned forward. Was it successful? I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed in the small room. Successful? Is that what you think this was? My voice cracked. I watched my team die. I watched Arya. My throat closed up. I couldn't finish the sentence. Harrington's expression didn't change. We need to know if the gate is still a threat. I stood abruptly, knocking the chair over. The gate wasn't the threat, it was us. We had no idea what we were dealing with, and we sent people through like they were disposable. Arya, she saved all of us. She saved Earth. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Saved Earth? How? I clenched my fists, trying to force the words out. She merged with the singularity. It needed a host. She became part of it, stabilized the collapse. Harrington was silent for a long moment. His eyes flicked to the file, then back to me. And she didn't come back? No, I whispered. He nodded slowly, his face impassive. Then the gate remains closed, for now. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. You did your duty, Graves. Sometimes that's all we can do. Duty. The word felt like a blade twisting in my gut. This wasn't about duty. This was about survival, about sacrifice. The door hissed shut behind him and I was alone again. I sank to the floor, pressing my palms against my eyes to stop the tears. I failed. No matter what Harrington said, no matter how many reports they filed, I had failed. And yet, in the quiet, I felt something, a faint warmth, like a memory brushing against my mind. A whisper that wasn't a whisper at all, but a presence. You're not alone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was soft but familiar, her voice. For a brief, shattering moment, I felt her, Arya, like a fragment of light in the darkness. It's okay, Ethan. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to reach out, to hold on to her, to never let her go again. But she was slipping away, fading like the glow beneath my skin. Be brave. The warmth disappeared, leaving only silence. Days passed, maybe weeks. They kept me under observation, cycling me through tests and interrogations. I answered their questions with deadened monotony, knowing they didn't really care about the truth. All they wanted was a story they could control, something they could bury under layers of classified files. But I knew the truth. Arya was still out there, woven into the fabric of that world, holding it together. She had become something more, and she'd given me a choice. I stood at the edge of the desert runway, the sun hanging low over the mountains. The base was behind me, its fences and cameras watching, but keeping their distance. In front of me was the horizon, a vast, open expanse that felt like freedom and emptiness all at once. They wanted me to go back to my old life, to write reports, follow orders, pretend none of it had happened. But I couldn't. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the fragment of Aria's data pad, the one piece of her I'd managed to bring back. I ran my thumb across its cracked surface. The gate had closed, but some part of me knew it wasn't forever. It could open again, and when it did, I had to be ready. The wind stirred the desert dust, and I closed my eyes, hearing the faint hum of a heartbeat not my own. Her heartbeat. I opened my eyes, staring out at the horizon. Be brave. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaving the base behind. The end. The wind howled across the barren Antarctic plain, carrying with it shards of ice that bit at the exposed skin of the researchers as they stepped off the transport. The sky was an endless sheet of pale gray, blending seamlessly with the white desert below. Dr. Elias Carr adjusted his goggles and stared at the distant plume of disturbed snow where the excavation site lay, a nervous excitement twisting in his gut. He had spent his entire life chasing enigmas hidden beneath the Earth's surface, but this was different. The seismic readings suggested something massive, artificial, not geological. Now, standing at the edge of discovery, he felt something else, something unplaceable, like an instinctual warning. Unbelievable, isn't it? Dr. Vivian Hauser's voice crackled through the radio in his hood. She was trudging beside him, her breath fogging the air. We're about to step into history, the first sentient structure ever found on Earth. I can't decide if I'm more excited or terrified. Carr didn't answer, focusing instead on the path ahead. The wind was too loud, and Hauser's words lingered in his mind longer than he liked. When they reached the excavation site, the scale of the anomaly hit him like a physical force. A jagged fissure yawned open in the ice, nearly 70 feet across, revealing a massive metallic surface far below. The research team had spent weeks boring into the ice, and now the entrance was finally exposed. The metal shimmered faintly, even in the weak sunlight, a dark gunmetal sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange geometric lines crisscrossed its surface, like veins on flesh. Surface temperature still reads -73, said O'Rourke, the team's communications specialist. He stood near a portable console, hunched against the cold, as the monitor beeped steadily. But there's an internal heat signature below the ice. Something's running down there. Carr nodded, though the information made his stomach churn. Let's get down there. The descent was slow, the team lowering themselves on harnesses into the fissure. The deeper they went, the quieter the world above became, until only the sound of their breathing and the groan of the ropes filled the void. As Carr's boots finally touched the smooth surface of the structure, an odd vibration hummed beneath his feet, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. "Feel that?" he asked Hauser as she landed beside him. She crouched, placing her gloved hand on the surface. "It's warm. How the hell is it warm?" O'Rourke joined them, trailing cables for the scanner equipment. He tapped the metal with the back of his glove. Solid. No seams. Whatever this is, it wasn't built in pieces. It's a single structure. His voice wavered, the humor gone. "Look at this." Hauser moved toward what appeared to be a hexagonal seam in the metal. The edges were too precise to be natural. She brushed away frost and revealed intricate carvings, not etched, but part of the metal itself. The symbols were angular, almost predatory in their sharpness. Carr's breath caught in his throat as the symbols glowed faintly beneath her hand. "Vivian, step back," he said quickly. But before she could move, the seam hissed and split open with a low groan, revealing a dark corridor that sloped downward into the structure. The air that escaped wasn't cold. It was warm and heavy, carrying with it an earthy, metallic tang that stuck to their throats. The interior walls glistened faintly, almost organic in texture. O'Rourke's voice was thin. "We shouldn't go in there. Whatever this place is, it's waking up." Carr hesitated. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back. But the pull of discovery was stronger. "We're here to find answers," he said, trying to steady himself. "Let's see what's inside." The team clicked on their helmet lights and stepped cautiously into the corridor. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the space was swallowing the sound. The deeper they ventured, the more the walls seemed to change. They shifted from smooth metal to a strange ribbed surface with overlapping ridges that shimmered wetly under their lights. "These walls," Hauser whispered. "They're growing." Carr didn't answer. He could feel it too, the sensation that the structure wasn't just ancient, but alive. They reached a larger chamber, its ceiling arched like the inside of a massive rib cage. In the center was a platform surrounded by cylindrical pods, encased in a translucent membranous film. Something dark and shapeless floated inside each pod, pulsating with a slow, alien rhythm. The chamber felt sacred like a tomb. And yet it was filled with an undeniable sense of anticipation. "Is this some kind of stasis chamber?" Hauser asked, stepping forward in awe. Her face was pale beneath the glow of her helmet light. "Look at the anatomy. They're not machines, they're biological." Before anyone could respond, one of the pods shuddered violently. O'Rourke flinched back, muttering a curse as the membrane split, spilling a thick, amber-colored fluid onto the platform. The thing inside twitched, its form writhing and reforming as though waking from a nightmare. The shape uncurled, long, sinewy limbs covered in a thin, webbed membrane. Its flesh was pale and translucent, veins spiderwebbing beneath its surface. Its head was grotesquely elongated, with sunken pits where eyes should have been. The creature's jaw split open horizontally, revealing rows of bone-like barbs that pulsed with motion. A low, vibrating hum filled the chamber. O'Rourke stumbled back, his breath ragged. What the hell is that?" Carr stepped forward, his mind torn between horror and fascination. "Stay calm," he whispered, though the words felt meaningless. The creature was moving now, its limbs stretching with an almost agonizing slowness. As it stood to its full height, it towered over them, its form impossible to comprehend. The hum grew louder, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt. It resonated in their bones, in their skulls. Then the creature did something that chilled Carr to his core. It raised one hand, not in attack, but in a slow, deliberate gesture of recognition. It knew they were there, and it had been waiting. "Everyone out!" Carr shouted, his voice shattering the moment. "Now!" The team turned and ran, their footsteps pounding down the corridor as the hum grew deafening behind them. The walls pulsed with light, shifting like muscle. As they reached the entrance, the hexagonal door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Carr stared into the darkness behind them and felt the cold hand of realization grip his heart. They weren't alone, and now the base was awake. The silence inside the base was suffocating. The only sound was their labored breathing as they huddled near the sealed entrance, their helmet lights casting nervous beams into the shadows. O'Rourke pounded on the door with the side of his fist, his breath ragged. "Sealed tight," he muttered. "We're trapped." Carr pressed his hand against the door's smooth surface, looking for any sign of a manual release. There was none. "We'll find another way out," he said, though the words felt hollow. Behind them, the hum in the chamber hadn't stopped. It had changed, the tone fluctuating in eerie, dissonant waves. Carr forced himself to turn and face the darkness. The massive chamber, with its pulsing walls and ancient pods, was no longer dormant. The pods around the platform were opening. Amber fluid poured onto the floor, pooling in thick rivulets around their feet. More of the strange, translucent membranes split apart, disgorging the grotesque shapes within. The creatures inside stirred sluggishly at first, their limbs twitching like newborns testing their bodies for the first time in centuries. Hauser stumbled back, her gloved hands pressed to her mouth. "There's more of them," she whispered. "God, there's so many." The nearest creature began to rise to its full height, its elongated limbs cracking like old wood as they extended. The thing's body was humanoid in the vaguest sense, 2 legs, 2 arms, but the proportions were wrong. Its torso was too long, its ribs visible beneath its translucent flesh. Its neck was spindly and crooked, barely supporting the grotesque, eyeless head that lolled at an odd angle. Carr's voice was barely audible. "Keep your distance." The creature turned toward them, its jaw unhinging with a sickening pop. A deep, vibrating resonance filled the air, not quite a growl, not quite speech. The other pods began releasing their occupants one by one, the sound of tearing membranes and sloshing fluid echoing through the chamber. Soon there were 5 of the things, standing motionless, as though waiting for some unseen command. Then they moved. One stepped forward with a disturbing grace, its clawed hand extended. The gesture wasn't hostile, it was almost curious. Carr's stomach twisted as the creature made a gurgling, wet, clicking noise that reverberated through the chamber. "They're communicating," Hauser said, eyes wide. "They're trying to—" The creature's arm blurred forward, lightning fast. Hauser barely had time to scream as its claws grazed the air an inch from her chest. Carr grabbed her and yanked her back just as the alien advanced another step, its skeletal fingers twitching. The other creatures began to stir, their heads swiveling toward the commotion. O'Rourke raised his rifle, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he shouted. His voice cracked as he aimed at the nearest creature. "I mean it." The alien paused, its head tilting slightly. Then, with a sudden jolt, it lunged forward. The muzzle flash lit the chamber in a strobe of white light. The first shot hit the creature in the chest, splitting the fragile skin open in a spray of dark, viscous ichor. But the thing didn't fall. Instead, it staggered back, its ribcage exposed. And then, impossibly, the bones began to knit themselves back together. O'Rourke fired again, and the creature let out a deafening harmonic screech that sent vibrations through the floor. The other creatures surged forward as one. "Run!" Carr yelled. They sprinted down the nearest corridor, their boots slipping on the slick, wet floor. The walls pulsed around them, the strange organic ridges contracting and expanding like muscle. The sound of the creature's pursuit filled the air. Wet slaps of feet on the floor, guttural screeches that echoed from all sides. The corridor twisted and branched in multiple directions, an endless, disorienting maze. "This way!" Carr pointed toward a passage that sloped downward. "Are you insane? We need to go up," O'Rourke shouted. "There's no up," Carr snapped. "It's sealed behind us." The passage opened into another large chamber, a hollow space filled with alien machinery. Strange tendrils of flesh-like cables hung from the ceiling, connecting to glowing pylons that pulsed in rhythmic patterns. In the center of the room stood a large obelisk-shaped console covered in the same angular glyphs they'd seen earlier. "It's some kind of control room," Hauser panted, doubling over. Carr moved toward the console, his eyes narrowing as he took in the symbols. "If there's a way to stop this place, it's here." Hauser knelt beside him, tracing her fingers over the glyphs. Her voice was barely a whisper. "These symbols, they're not just instructions. They're anatomical diagrams, genetic sequences. This whole place, it's not just a base, it's an incubation site." "Vivian!" Carr's warning was cut short as the alien creatures poured into the room. O'Rourke raised his rifle again, but one of the creatures moved faster than he could react. Its spindly arm lashed out and wrapped around his torso, lifting him off the floor like a rag doll. He screamed as the creature's claws sank into his sides, pinning him in place. Carr could only watch in horror as the alien's jaw unhinged and widened. Thin, proboscis-like tendrils slithered out, writhing in the air before piercing O'Rourke's face. His screams turned into gurgling, inhuman noises as the tendrils burrowed deep. His body convulsed violently, then went still. "No!" Hauser screamed, lunging forward, but Carr grabbed her, pulling her back. O'Rourke's head lolled, his eyes wide and glassy. The alien lowered him to the floor, where he twitched once before rising. His limbs jerked unnaturally, the tendrils still embedded in his skull. His skin rippled as if something beneath it was moving. Carr felt bile rise in his throat. O'Rourke wasn't human anymore. The creature that had infected him let out another low hum, and O'Rourke's body echoed the sound, perfectly in tune. He turned toward them, his mouth splitting into an unholy grin. His voice came out broken and garbled, but still somehow recognizable. "Join us," he rasped. Carr grabbed Hauser's arm. "Move!" They sprinted toward the far end of the chamber, dodging the outstretched limbs of the other creatures. O'Rourke's distorted laughter echoed behind them, reverberating in their skulls. As they stumbled into another corridor, Hauser's sobs shook her body. "We left him! We left him!" Carr's face was grim. That wasn't him anymore. The corridor sloped further downward and the heat in the base grew oppressive. Carr's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what they had awakened. These creatures weren't just guardians, they were a form of bioengineered perfection, a horrifying blend of biology and machinery designed to infect and absorb. They had stumbled into something far older and far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. And now it was awake. The corridor stretched endlessly before them, twisting in unnatural ways, as if the structure itself was rearranging to trap them. The pulsating hum reverberated through the walls like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. Every step Carr took felt heavier, as though the air itself was thickening around him. Hauser stumbled beside him, her breathing ragged. She hadn't spoken since O'Rourke's death. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat despite the frigid temperatures they had grown used to. Carr didn't blame her. He could still hear O'Rourke's distorted laughter in his mind, the voice of a man they'd known, twisted into something alien and vile. The corridor led them into another vast chamber, this one lined with rows of strange, cylindrical structures embedded into the walls like honeycombs. Some were empty, but others still held things inside, half-formed shapes suspended in thick, amber fluid. Carr forced himself to look away from the writhing shadows behind the glass-like surfaces. "We're running in circles," Hauser whispered, her voice hollow. Carr wiped a trembling hand across his face. "Number. We're not giving up. There has to be a way out." Hauser sank to her knees, staring blankly at the floor. "It's alive, Elias. The whole base. It's not just a building. It's some kind of organism. And we're inside it. We're food." Carr knelt beside her, grabbing her shoulders. "We're not dead yet. We can still stop this." He tried to sound confident, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own terror. Hauser met his eyes, her pupils dilated and unfocused. "You don't get it," she murmured. "They're speaking to me. I can hear them. In my head." Carr's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" She clutched the sides of her head, her fingers digging into her scalp. "The symbols, the glyphs. We thought they were just language, but they're more than that. They're instructions, genetic blueprints, and now I can feel them inside me." She looked up, her eyes glassy with tears. "They're showing me things, Elias. Beautiful things." Carr shook her, panic rising in his chest. "You're not making any sense. Snap out of it, Hauser." She let out a soft, breathless laugh, her expression distant. "I understand now. We were never meant to resist. We're just raw material." Suddenly she screamed, a horrible, guttural sound, and doubled over, clutching her stomach. Her body convulsed violently, as though something inside her was twisting her organs. Carr grabbed her, trying to hold her steady, but she thrashed like a dying animal. "Hauser," he yelled. Her skin rippled beneath his hands, as though something just beneath the surface was shifting. Her veins bulged, black against her pale flesh, and her face contorted in agony. With a final shuddering breath, she collapsed to the floor. Carr's heart pounded as he knelt over her. "Vivian, no, 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 stay with me." Her body was still, and then she exhaled a long, slow breath. Her eyes opened again, but they were different. Too wide, too calm. "Elias," she whispered. Her voice was her own again, soft and familiar. "You have to see what they've seen." Carr stumbled back as she rose unsteadily to her feet. Her movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise. Her lips twitched upward in a strange, almost serene smile. "They want to make us whole," she said. Her fingers flexed unnaturally, the joints popping. "You don't have to fight it. Just let it happen." Carr's mind screamed at him to run, but he couldn't look away. The person standing before him was no longer the Hauser he knew. Her skin began to split in delicate lines along her arms, revealing sinewy strands of something that shimmered wetly in the dim light. She took a step toward him, her eyes filled with a terrifying alien serenity. "It doesn't hurt," she whispered. Carr's survival instincts kicked in. He scrambled to his feet and backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "Stay back." Hauser, the thing that had been Hauser, tilted her head curiously as though puzzled by his fear. "You don't understand yet, but you will." Behind her, the walls shifted, opening like a gaping wound. Dozens of long, sinewy tendrils unfurled from the darkness, writhing and twisting. Carr turned and ran, his legs burning as he sprinted down another corridor. Hauser's voice followed him, soft and coaxing. "You can't run from this, Elias. It's already inside you." He didn't look back. Carr ran until his lungs burned, until his vision blurred with exhaustion and fear. The corridors twisted around him like the intestines of some colossal beast. His surroundings pulsed with an almost mocking rhythm. He stumbled into another chamber, smaller this time, with low ceilings and more of the strange alien consoles embedded in the walls. He collapsed against the nearest surface, gasping for air. The console flickered to life beneath his hand, its glyphs glowing faintly. Carr blinked in surprise and leaned closer. The symbols shifted and rearranged, forming strange patterns that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Maybe there's a way to shut it down, he thought desperately. His fingers hovered over the console as he tried to decipher the alien script. But as he worked, a sharp metallic voice cut through the silence. "You're wasting your time." Carr froze. O'Rourke stepped out of the shadows, or what was left of him. His face was twisted and wrong, stretched too far across his skull, the skin drawn tight like wet parchment. His eyes glowed faintly with a sickly amber light. His grin was grotesque, his teeth exposed through cracks in his cheeks. "You think you can stop it?" O'Rourke's voice was garbled, interspersed with wet clicks. "You can't. It's bigger than you, bigger than all of us." Carr's hand tightened into a fist. "You're not O'Rourke," he spat. "You're just a puppet." O'Rourke chuckled, a hideous gurgling sound. "Maybe, but soon you'll be one too." The sound of footsteps echoed behind Carr. He turned to see Hauser standing in the doorway, her body a grotesque fusion of flesh and something metallic. Her eyes shone with that same alien light. Carr's mind teetered on the edge of collapse. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and out of time. "You don't have to be afraid," Hauser said softly. "We can make you better, stronger. You just have to let go." Carr's gaze darted to the console, the glyphs still pulsing beneath his hand. He had one chance. With a cry of defiance, he slammed his hand down on the console. The chamber shook violently as the machinery surged to life, a deafening hum filling the air. The walls began to convulse, veins of amber light crackling through the structure like a nervous system exposed to pain. O'Rourke screamed, a sound that was no longer human, as his body spasmed and collapsed. Hauser's face twisted in confusion and fury. The walls split open, and a wave of thick, gelatinous fluid spilled out, knocking Carr off his feet. The chamber was collapsing in on itself. Carr forced himself to his feet, staggering toward the nearest exit as the base convulsed like a dying beast. Hauser's voice rang out behind him, no longer soft, but enraged and distorted. "You can't escape evolution, Elias." He didn't stop. He ran, ignoring the tremors beneath his feet, ignoring the distant echoes of screams. All that mattered now was survival. And behind him, something far more ancient than humanity writhed in agony, preparing for its final act. Carr's boots slammed against the trembling floor, splashing through thick puddles of viscous fluid as he sprinted down the narrowing corridor. The air pulsed with heat, thick with the metallic stench of blood and machinery. The living walls convulsed, veins of bioluminescent amber splitting open like infected wounds. The structure was coming apart, dying perhaps, or being born into something else. The sound of Hauser's twisted voice echoed behind him, impossibly close. "Elias!" she screamed, her tone a discordant mix of fury and pleading. "You can't stop it. You belong to us now." Carr's chest heaved with each breath as he forced himself to ignore her. He felt her words clawing at the edges of his mind like barbed hooks digging deeper with every syllable. He shoved the voice away, focusing only on what lay ahead. The corridor opened into a vast cathedral-like chamber. Carr skidded to a stop, his heart pounding. This was it, the core. A massive alien monolith rose from the center of the chamber, spiraling upward like a nightmarish spine. Its surface pulsed with veins of glowing amber, and embedded deep within it was something horrific. A pulsating mass of tangled organic matter entwined with black, metallic tendrils. The shape of it was almost humanoid, but grotesquely exaggerated, its limbs sprawled and twisted. The head was an exposed brain-like cluster of neural tissue, crowned with a lattice of bone-like spires. Carr's knees nearly buckled as a wave of raw thoughts slammed into his mind. Join. Assimilate. Ascend. The words weren't spoken. They were felt, seared into his skull with such force that his vision blurred. He dropped to one knee, clutching his head. Images flashed through his mind, planets consumed, civilizations transformed, their bodies unraveled and remade into something monstrous and beautiful. He saw humanity twisted into a hive of flesh and steel, their identities erased, their thoughts replaced with a single, endless purpose. The Wraith Queen's thoughts coiled around his consciousness like serpents. She was older than Earth itself, an ancient force of evolution, abandoned by her creators but never truly dormant. The base was never a shelter or a prison. It was a womb, a place where she would regenerate and begin her conquest anew. "This is the future," the voice whispered. "Your species is flawed, but you can be perfected." "No!" Carr's voice was raw, defiant. He forced himself to stand, staggering toward the alien console at the base of the monolith. The glyphs shifted and writhed beneath his gaze, their patterns dizzying and alien. But there was a grim logic to it, a sequence of commands. He didn't know how he understood it, but he did. Behind him, the entrance to the chamber exploded outward as Hauser and O'Rourke stumbled in, their bodies grotesquely elongated and fused with shimmering tendrils of alien tissue. Hauser's face was barely human now. Her skin had split into a mask of interlocking sinew, and her fingers were long, segmented appendages that clicked unnervingly as she walked. "Please," she whispered, though her voice had lost all warmth. "It doesn't have to end like this. You can still join us." Carr placed his hand on the console, ignoring the burn as the glyphs lit up beneath his palm. "I'm not becoming one of you." O'Rourke stepped forward, his warped jaw hanging open as his ruined vocal cords gurgled a warning. The Queen's psychic pressure intensified, but Carr gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. His fingers danced across the glyphs in a desperate, final sequence. The monolith began to scream. A deafening, keening wail reverberated through the chamber, shaking the walls and sending fissures of amber light across the floor. The Queen's exposed neural mass writhed, her tendrils thrashing wildly as bolts of alien energy arced through her body. Hauser shrieked, doubling over as the tendrils in her body spasmed. "No! What have you done?" Carr's voice was steady now, filled with grim finality. "I've shut you down." The Queen's voice roared in his mind, an incoherent blend of rage and despair. The structure around them began to collapse, the organic walls rupturing as jets of pressurized fluid burst from their veins. Carr stumbled back as the monolith cracked apart, its spires toppling. The chamber floor split, revealing a churning abyss below, its depths glowing with a molten alien energy. Hauser reached for him, her expression flickering between rage and sorrow. "You don't understand. You could have saved us." Carr watched her stumble toward the edge. She teetered for a moment, her alien limbs twitching uncontrollably, before she fell into the abyss. Her form twisted as it plummeted, swallowed by the infernal glow below. O'Rourke let out a final, unearthly wail before collapsing into a heap of twitching sinew. The Queen's neural mass split open, spilling its contents in a flood of black ichor. The monolith disintegrated, its collapse sending tremors through the entire base. Carr turned and ran. The corridors behind him crumbled as he sprinted through the disintegrating structure. The walls folded inward, collapsing into viscous pools. The air was thick with heat and smoke, but Carr kept moving, his lungs burning as the last stretch of the tunnel came into view. A blinding shaft of daylight cut through the darkness ahead. With one final burst of strength, Carr threw himself forward. He landed hard on the ice, sliding across the snow as a thunderous explosion erupted behind him. A massive plume of ash and steam shot into the sky as the base imploded, the ground splitting open in jagged fractures. Carr shielded his eyes from the blinding light as shockwaves rolled across the landscape. When the dust settled, there was nothing left but a smoldering crater where the base had been. Carr lay on his back, staring up at the endless gray sky, his body trembling from exhaustion and pain. The howling Antarctic wind began to pick up again, stinging his skin as reality set in. He was alive, but barely. The sound of rotor blades broke the silence. A distant black dot grew larger as a rescue helicopter descended toward him, its floodlights cutting through the haze. Carr's eyes fluttered shut as a wave of relief washed over him. But even as he drifted toward unconsciousness, a cold dread settled in his chest. He had destroyed the base, but had he destroyed the Queen? Or had something survived beneath the ice? The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the fractured ice beneath his feet, and the faint, pulsing glow of something far below. The war wasn't over, and the next time they would be ready.